Well, hello, um, and welcome to our online confirmation. Um, Today we're going to talk about a woman named Rahab. Now, before we start talking about her story, there's a couple of things we need to know, to keep in mind. The first off is that we don't only find Rahab in the Old Testament. We find her in the New Testament. In fact, we find her in the first chapter of Matthew when they're talking about Jesus' ancestors. And Matthew begins with Jesus' genealogy, begins with Abraham, but we get to verse 5, and there's Rahab. Now, the thing about these genealogies is that usually, it lists the men. It starts out Abraham, the father of Isaac, Isaac, the father of Jacob, Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. It's another woman, and then we get father after father after father. In verse 5, we get Solomon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz is the grandfather of King David. And we know that Jesus we call him the son of David, because it's through King David that God gave the promise that one of his descendants will always be on the throne of Israel, and that the Christ, the anointed one, will be coming from his line. And so it's important that they show that Jesus is related to David. I want to point out that Jesus is related to this woman named Rahab. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that these Bible stories, a lot of the heroes, a lot of the people mentioned in here are men. And that's because they were written by men. One, they were written by men. Two, it was a patriarchal society, which means that usually outside of the house, the men were in charge. And so because of that, a lot of the stories name men as the hero of that story. But there are a few women. We see them listed in Jesus' genealogy. There's a few women whose story is so important that they can't be ignored. And so they are written into the story of God and the story of Israel. Rahab's story is one of these. So let's go back. We go back to Rahab, and she shows up in the book of Joshua. In the second chapter, Joshua is the first book after what's called the 5 books of Moses. The Israelites are done wandering around. They have escaped Egypt. They are ready to enter the promised land. And so in order to do that and to see what they're getting into, Joshua, who's now the leader because Moses had died, sent some spies into the land just to check things out. This was done before. Moses sent spies into the land. Of course, they came back and they were scared, and they made up stories of how big and awesome and terrible the warriors were in these lands, and so they decided not to enter, which made God mad, which is why they wandered around in circles for another 40 years. They're getting ready to enter now. They had They're on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're getting ready to cross it to the west side. And, they had some battles with some kingdoms, some small kingdoms, and they won those battles, and now they inhabited some land on the east side. These stories were known. The people had heard about this army of Israelites who are on their way. They heard the stories. So Joshua is now getting ready to do as God had commanded, to enter into the promised land. And so he sends out his spies. And they go into Jericho. And Jericho is one of these towns. It's an important town. It's been there. You can still go to Jericho. It's been there for a long time. It sits at the end of the Jordan River, right before it dumps into the Dead Sea. So it's in a strategic spot. And so these spies, they go into Jericho, and they end up going to Rahab's house. Now here we are, chapter 2 of the Bible, of the book of Joshua. And it says these men, they went in to Jericho, and they entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab. Now, I'm sure you all know what a prostitute is. This is a sex trafficker. And they went into her house. We don't know why. Maybe that's the best place to get information. Maybe they were done gathering information and they were on their way back to Joshua and they needed a place to stay for the night. Whatever the reason is, this is where they went. They went to the house of Rahab, who was a prostitute. And there were other women in there who were prostitutes. So she kind of ran a brothel. And these men, while they were in there, the king of Jericho had heard from his spies that there were these Israelites were in town and that they were in Rahab's house. So he comes there and he talks to her and he demands that she bring these guys out, that they're spies. And Rahab says, well, they were here. I didn't know who they were. I get a lot of people coming and going. They left already. Right before the gates closed for the night, they took off and they left and they headed down towards the Jordan, which would be the natural way for them to go. Meanwhile, she had some of her women take the men up to the roof and hide them. So when the soldiers did a quick search, they didn't find them. They were hiding up in the roof. Now this house of Rahab's is up against the outer wall of Jericho. And so she goes to these men after the king leaves with his men, and this is what she says. Now remember, they heard about these other battles. She says, I know that the Lord has given the land to you. And because of that, we are afraid. And all the people of the land are going to melt in fear before you. Because we have heard the stories. We know how God had dried up the water of the Red Sea so that you could get out of Egypt. We know what you did to those two kings on the other side of the Jordan. How you utterly destroyed them. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted in fear. The Lord, your God, is indeed God. The God of heaven above, the God of earth below. She says, I want you to deal kindly with me because I have dealt kindly with you. Swear to me by your God that you will deal kindly with my family that you will spare my mom and my dad, my brothers and my sisters, and all the people of our families, and deliver them from death. And the men said, we will. If you are faithful with us, we will be faithful with you. And then she took them to a window which was on the outer wall, and she let them out by a rope, telling them to go into the hills for a couple of days and hide out before the king stops looking for them. And then they can go back to their army. And the men said to her, take this red cord, take this red piece of cloth and hang it out this same window that you just let us out of. Hang it out there to let us know that you are in there and that you are in there with your family. And if you keep your family in there, we will not destroy this house and they will be safe. Now remember when we were talking about Moses and about the Israelites leaving Egypt on the night of the Passover. What did they do? They took the blood of the lamb and they painted it on the door frame. It was red. You know that. Lamb's blood is red. And so they're not saying this to put blood on the window, but they're saying use a red cloth. Hang this red cloth out the window and we will know that you are there and we will save you. And when Jericho invaded and the red cloth was there, they didn't destroy that house and they saved that house. And then later we read that this prostitute is an ancestor of Jesus. I want you to think about that. Jesus, the Son of God, the Holy and Mighty One. Jesus, who we proclaim has given us life out of death. Jesus, who we worship, that has forgiven all our sins. This Jesus, this pure and innocent Jesus, as a prostitute, as an ancestor. Think about that. Let that kind of sink in. Because I want you to think about what kind of people does God use to save us? Does God use to show us God's mercy and God's love? Does God use the big and the strong? Yeah, sometimes. God uses everyone, even the people that we wouldn't want to even associate with. They are people that God loves. They are people that Jesus has died for. So this woman's story, it's there, it's in the Bible. People have wanted to take it out of the Bible for so many years. Why is a prostitute in the Bible? And why this story? And they can't, because her story is important. Her story is so important that we can't ignore it. This book, the Bible that was written by men and has the story of God's relationship in the world, of God in the world, and the people of Israel's relationship with God, and then through Jesus, our relationship with God. Written by men, edited by men, But in here, you hear the voice of women. And their voice is so important to telling the story of God. They couldn't erase Rahab's voice. It is there to tell us she knew who God was before the people came. Maybe had even more faith in God than the people that Joshua was leading, because they've been grumbling and fighting and arguing with God ever since they left Egypt. And here she proclaims God, Lord of heaven and earth. So I want you to go to Joshua chapter 2, read the story. Hear the story of Rahab. Think about why it's important. Think about the people that God uses, that God works through. I shouldn't say uses, that God works through. And who is somebody that you might want to ignore. And then unexpectedly they come and they speak the truth of God to you. Anyway, that is the story of Rahab. When next we meet, we will speak of another leader of the Israelites. As we move into a time of Israelite leaders called the Judges, a time when they're settling into the Promised Land. And this person is also a woman, one whose voice is strong, one who we hear the truth of God through her words. So we'll come back and we'll talk about Deborah. But until then, have a blessed week. And hopefully next week we can be together in person.